Hello and welcome to my Real Estate Exam Prep podcast series. Over the last 20 years, I've helped hundreds of students start their real estate careers. My goal with this podcast series is to help you pass your exams. You can check out all 11 podcasts in this National Exam Prep series. For more information, watch my full lesson videos on each topic on my YouTube channel at Tom's Next Level Real Estate. Today we're going to focus on agency and what you need to know to pass your exams. The most important thing I can share with you about agency is that the word agency means representation. Anytime you get confused on your test about what they're talking about with regard to agency, just substitute the word representation for the word agency. For example, an agency agreement is a representation agreement, buyer or seller representation. Here's a thought for you. What would be a common term for a seller agency agreement? That's a mouthful, seller agency agreement. Well, in reality, in the marketplace, it's a listing. A seller agency agreement is a seller representation agreement. If that helps you sort of sort out some of the things you'll run into when you see the word agency, always think of the word representation. Now, in any agency relationship, there are only two parties. Please remember that for your exam. There's only two parties in an agency or a representation relationship. There's a principal and an agent. That's another key point to remember as you go through your exam and your other coursework. There's only two parties, a principal and an agent. A principal is the one who employs the agent, and the agent is the one who is employed by that principal to represent them. So let's take a look at your real estate firm, for instance. A seller signs a seller agency agreement, and now the seller wants the broker to represent them. So let's break that down real quick. When a seller signs a listing agreement, who are they hiring to represent them? From your coursework, you know that the broker owns all contracts. So in reality, the seller is hiring the broker to represent them. Even though you're the salesperson out there talking to the seller and you sign the agency agreement, the listing agreement with the seller, and the seller signs it, remember this, the seller is actually hiring the broker to represent them. So in that relationship, who's the principal and who's the agent? Well, clearly the seller is the principal and the broker is the agent of the seller. Now, a lot of times you get caught up in word salad in your test questions, so make sure that you make sure you know who is hiring who. So the seller hires the broker. But now let's go further in the firm. Well, who hired you as a salesperson? You're a salesperson who was hired by your broker to represent the firm and the brokerage. Well, in that relationship, who's the principal? That's your broker. And who is the broker hiring as an agent in an agency relationship? The broker is hiring you as a salesperson. So in that relationship, you as a salesperson are an agent for your broker, but the broker is your principal. So take a look at what's happening here and think about this. In the brokerage firm, the broker is both an agent of the firm's clients, and also the broker is your principal. So in any firm, the broker is both principal and agent. So as you read your test questions, read them very carefully and look for those words. All right? When a seller or a buyer signs an agency agreement with a broker, they actually then become a client of the firm. They become a client because they have a signed agency agreement. And the broker hires you as a salesperson to be an agent for the broker to help the broker represent those clients. Now, I want you to make a clear distinction as you review your coursework and in your exam. Watch out for the word customer. There's a vast difference between a client and a customer. You have to know that distinction. A client is somebody who has signed an agency agreement with the brokerage firm. But a customer is just somebody who you as a salesperson might assist or might help in finding a house, for instance. Let me give you a clear example. You're in an open house. You did secure a listing and you're holding one of your first open houses, and the seller is a client of the firm, and in the front door walks a person who says they're looking for a home. You do what you're supposed to do. You ask them if they're represented by any other brokerage firm, and they say, no, we're not represented. So then you ask them, would you like me to help you find a house? Would you like me and our firm to represent you as a buyer? And they say, no, thank you. We just met you. We're not sure we want to sign an agency agreement with you, but you know what? We would like you to help us find a house. So the question is, can you help them find a house without a signed buyer agency agreement with them? In most cases you can. There's some risks to that. You may not get paid because there's no agreement. But in reality, just in simple terms, can you help them find a house to buy? Yes. Do you represent them? No. So they're not a client of the firm. They are just a customer. Sometimes on the exam they'll use the word consumer, or they might call that party a third party because there's no representation agreement. So just remember to study and review the difference between a client and a customer, which could also be referred to as a consumer or a third party. I want to stay on this idea of a customer just for another minute or two because it'll be important for your exam. If you are working with somebody as a customer, you don't represent them. You can help them. In some states, they're called a facilitator. You could be a facilitator with that customer. You don't represent them, but you still owe them two duties, two fiduciary duties: honesty and fairness. Honesty and fair dealing. You still owe those fiduciary duties to a customer even though you don't represent them and the firm doesn't represent them. Now, I used the term a minute ago, working with. If you see that on the exam, I want to stress that if a scenario test question says something like, Tom is working with a buyer, and then goes on to ask a couple questions about how Tom should work with that buyer, they mean on the exam that that buyer is a customer or consumer. That buyer is unrepresented. So watch for the two key terms, working with. Otherwise, the test question would say, Tom represents a buyer, and then go on with a question. If they say Tom represents a buyer, now that buyer is a client of the firm, because agency means representation, right? So working with means that buyer is a consumer. Now, you'll deal with four types of agency in your career: buyer agency, seller agency, dual agency, which is not allowed in some states but is in others. And a fourth type of agency is actually a misnomer. It's called a facilitator. And actually, a facilitator is a non-agency relationship. It's just what we've talked about with consumers or customers. They are unrepresented, and you would be a facilitator when you work with them because there is no agency relationship with a consumer or a customer. And I already mentioned inside the brokerage who the principal and the agents are, and that can be very confusing when you're reading test questions. they usually are very cautious when they write test questions to refer to as a salesperson in the brokerage as just that, a salesperson, not an agent, especially when it's an agency question. So just to recap what we started with, in the brokerage firm, the broker represents the firm's clients because the clients are hiring the broker to represent them. So in that relationship, the client is the principal and the broker is the agent of their principal. But in your relationship with your broker as a salesperson, the broker is hiring you to represent the brokerage. So that broker is your principal and you are an agent for your broker. That's why I always try and be cautious when I present these classes to use the term salesperson instead of agent, because when you get into all of these agency relationships, it can be confusing. So be careful about that when you take the test. And note this again, I'll restate this from earlier. In the brokerage firm, the broker is both agent and principal. The broker is an agent for the firm's clients, but the broker is the principal for all of the firm's salespeople. Now, let's talk a little bit about different types of agency: special agency, general agency, and universal agency. Special agency means the agent has no ability to bind or to obligate their principal. So in the brokerage firm, what would that be? That would be the broker to the firm's clients. Let's say a seller who has a listing agreement with the brokerage. The broker can't bind that seller or obligate that seller to anything. The broker can't call the seller up one day and say, hey, you've been out of town for a few days. There was a good offer that came in on your house. I thought you'd like it, so I, as the broker, signed and accepted an offer on your house. The broker can't do that. They can't obligate their principal because that agency relationship between the broker and the client is a special agency relationship. Now, the agency relationship you have as a salesperson with your broker is different. That's a general agency relationship. That means you as the salesperson and a general agent for your broker, you have the ability, limited ability, to bind your broker. Here's the best context I can put that in. You're out talking with a prospect, and that prospect says, yes, they'd like to list their house with your firm. So you pull out a listing agreement, and the seller signs a listing agreement, and you, as the salesperson, sign the listing agreement. But because you have a general agency relationship with your broker, is your broker now obligated to perform on that listing agreement? Yes, your broker is. So even though the broker hasn't signed that listing agreement with the seller you're in front of, the broker is obligated to perform on that listing agreement. And why is that? Because you and your broker have a general agency relationship, which means you have the limited ability to bind your broker to certain duties. So that's the difference there. Remember who's who in those special and general agency relationships. Now, the third type of agency, there'll be a couple of questions on the exam about, is universal agency. Probably won't run into that much in your real estate career, but in the real world of agency, a universal agent has an unlimited ability to bind their principal. So in a universal agency relationship, there's a document signed that's called power of attorney. So if the principal signs a power of attorney form, that creates an agency relationship that gives the agent the unlimited ability to bind their principal. They can sign any and all documents for their principal. So just know that concept. They'll ask you general questions. Here's a couple of key points about universal agency. The form the principal would sign is called a power of attorney form. But what is created when that form is signed is an attorney in fact. A universal agent is referred to as an attorney in fact. Let's talk about fiduciary duties and how they're going to show up on your exam. Fiduciary duties are owed by every agent to their principal. You've got 6 fiduciary duties. You've studied those in your coursework. Obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable skill and care. The acronym you often see is OLD CAR or COLD AC, however you study those or remember those. But here's my test tip for you. In the exam, they'll often give you a question this way. They will say something like, or the test question might go this way: if an agent only shows property to the buyer that pays the agent the highest commission, which fiduciary duty is the agent violating? You see what they've done there? Instead of asking you what's included in each fiduciary duty, they'll give you an example of a violation and then ask you which fiduciary duty is the agent violating. In our case, it's the fiduciary duty of loyalty. If you only show properties to buyers that pay you as an agent the highest commission, then you're violating the fiduciary duty of loyalty, which says, just to recap, you have to keep your client's interest above all others, even your own interest. That's the fiduciary duty of loyalty. So study those that way. Know an example of each one of the duties, and then watch for the test question that might ask it in reverse, if I can state it that way. They might give you the violation and then ask you which duty is being violated. Here's another key point for your exam. Every agent owes their principal fiduciary duties. So your broker, who is an agent for the sellers and the buyers, your broker owes all of the firm's clients the same fiduciary duties. But you, since your broker is your principal and you're an agent for your broker, you also owe these same 6 fiduciary duties to your principal, who is the broker. But there's also another step here. You, as an agent of your broker, owe the same fiduciary duties to the firm's clients that the broker owes those clients. So you owe the same fiduciary duties not only to your brokerage, but to the client. Okay? Now we need to discuss disclosure of agency, when you disclose, and what you must disclose. There'll be several questions on the exam about this. The overriding point is you must disclose your agency relationships at the first substantive contact with any consumer. Well, how are we defining a substantive contact? Any discussion of price, terms, or motivation. PTM's the acronym we use. You probably covered that in your coursework. Price, terms, or motivation. Let me give you some context, a little example here. You're in your open house that we talked about earlier. In your listing with your broker, a consumer walks in the front door and says, "This is a nice house, we'd like to look around." And you ask that consumer, remember earlier you asked them if they were represented, and they said, no, they're not. And so at that point, what if they say this? We're not represented, however, we're looking to buy a house in the area. We want to spend about $300,000 and we're cash buyers. I'm being transferred on my job, so I need to move right away. Well, that consumer has already blurted out all 3 of those: price, terms, and motivation, right? You know a lot about that buyer right now. So at that point, you have to stop that person from talking any further and say, before you go any further, let me explain my relationship and make an agency disclosure to you. So this is what you have to tell that consumer. I, as a salesperson, represent the seller. I have to tell the seller anything I know about any potential buyers, and I have to give you a form. In some states it's an oral, it can be in writing, in some states it's an actual form. But I must, as a salesperson, disclose to you as a consumer what your options are for representation or non-representation. I can represent you as a buyer broker, or I can not represent you. But actually what's happening in there in the marketplace is the government views us as salespeople as the wolves, and they view the consumers as the sheep. So it's up to us in the marketplace as wolves to educate the sheep about what their options are and tell that consumer exactly this. You have to say to them, don't tell me anything that you don't want my seller to know. If in fact you want to make an offer on this property, don't tell me anything you don't want me to tell the seller. Because not only can I tell the seller, I have to tell the seller because I represent the seller. And since I don't represent you, I have no duty of confidentiality. So you have to follow that procedure. The bottom line for the exam is, when do you have to disclose agency relationships? At the first substantive contact. So what else do you need to disclose to anybody you work with as a real estate agent of your broker? You have to disclose any conflicts of interest or self-interest you might have. Can you put your own house in the MLS and sell it as a for sale by owner? Absolutely you can. But in that listing, you have to say what? You have to say, I'm a licensed real estate salesperson and I'm an agent and it's my house. You see this all the time in MLS listings, for sale by owner agent. So you have to disclose any kind. Can you buy a house for yourself? If you go out in the marketplace, look through the MLS and say, yeah, I want to move. This is a great house. So you want to talk to the listing agent and make an offer to buy a house. Can you do that for yourself? Of course you can. But what do you have to disclose in your offer? That you're the buyer. You can't say, oh, I'm working with a very special buyer and here's an offer we'd like to make. You can't hide the fact that you're the buyer, you're the potential buyer in that offer. So you have to disclose all of those conflicts. And you also have to disclose if you're representing a relative. Now, I use the term a first-tier relative. In other words, if you're going to help your mother, father, son or daughter, brother or sister, if you're going to help one of them find a house, you have to disclose that you're representing a relative. You can't hide that fact from any prospective seller. What I want you to do is watch out in the test questions for things like this. The question might be a scenario question set up that says, you're representing your brother or sister in purchasing a house. You make, and they make an offer to a seller. Do you as an agent have to make any additional disclosures to the seller? The answer is yes. You have to disclose that your client is a relative. My final topic in this podcast today about agency is, how does agency ever terminate? There will be a few questions on the exam about the termination of agency agreements. How do they ever end? Well, there's 6 ways, and you need to review these and make sure that you understand these for the exam, because they'll ask you questions different ways. First of all, termination of agency. The first way that they can terminate is by full performance. If you have a listing agreement with a seller and the house sells and closes, that terminates the agency agreement. If you have a buyer-broker agreement with a buyer and the buyer finds a house and it closes, that terminates the agreement. So full performance is the first one. That's pretty easy. Or expiration of that agency agreement. What if it expires? The listing or the buyer-broker agreement expired. They didn't relist or sign a new buyer agreement with you. and it has expired, so that ends the agency relationship. Here's one they'll ask you about on the exam. The death of a principal or the broker would terminate an agency relationship. So let's go back to our running example here where you have listed a house on behalf of your broker. You got the listing signed, but remember the seller is hiring the broker and the broker hires you. So in the listing agreement, which is a seller agency agreement, who's the principal? That's the client. That's the seller. And who's the agent in that agency agreement? The broker. The broker is the agent of the seller. So if the seller in our example dies, the principal dies, or the broker dies, that terminates that agency agreement. Death of a principal or the broker. Here's how they'll phrase it on the exam. What about if you, as a salesperson, what if you die? Does that terminate the agreement? No. No, because you as a salesperson are not part of that agency agreement. That agency agreement is between the seller and the broker. The broker's principal and the broker as the principal's agent. Those are the only two parties in that agency agreement. So remember, death of the principal or the broker terminates that agency agreement. But death of a salesperson does not. Mutual agreement. That's the fourth way that an agency agreement can terminate. What if the seller says one day, you know what, this was a bad idea. We really don't want to move. Will you cancel our listing agreement with you? And the broker might agree. And if the broker, for whatever reason, agrees to that, now you have both parties, the principal and agent, in the agency agreement, mutually agreeing to terminate the agreement or cancel it, then it does terminate. Okay? Fifth way is, what if the house burns down? If it's a listing, what if the house burns down? Destruction of the property. That typically is going to terminate the listing agreement. There's nothing to sell right now. So destruction of property is the fifth way. And the last way is if there's a breach in the contract, a breach in the agency agreement. If one party or the other breaches the contract. Now that might lead to a lawsuit, by one party or the other. If the seller decides at the last minute before closing, we just don't want to sell. So now we're going to breach our contract. You found us a buyer ready, willing, and able to close, but we decided we don't want to close. Well, the contract says they still owe a commission to the brokerage. But if either party breaches a contract, then that could lead to termination. But typically there's lawsuits involved in that case. Thank you very much for listening to my podcast on agency. I have a couple other test tips for you before we go. Always make sure you read every question very carefully. I used to use the acronym in my classes RDQ, and it just means read the darn question. Sometimes you have to read it 2 or 3 times to make sure you understand exactly what they're asking, especially in this section here with agency. When you have the broker is also an agent and salespeople are agents of the broker and principals, and it's easy to get those words confused. So make sure you read the question sometimes 2 or 3 times to make sure you understand it. And also know that when you see a question that seems particularly cumbersome, they're not trying to trick you. What they're doing is trying to test not only your knowledge of the subject, but it's also, from a test writer's standpoint, a reading comprehension test. They're testing how well you can read the questions and understand what they're really asking you. So just knowing now that they are also reading comprehension questions in there and answering them as such, you're going to be responsible for reading contracts, going over details with buyers and sellers and clients. So it's important that you understand how to read questions very carefully, read documents very carefully. So reading comprehension is a big part of what they're testing you on. If you want more information about agency or any of the other 10 national exam prep topics, you can go to my YouTube channel at Tom's Next Level Real Estate and watch my full lesson videos. And always remember, your success is my goal.